Hi everyone. Welcome to the third of the practice preps we are doing for Campbelltown Australs. I'm sure that hopefully some of you, if you're, it would be a strange choice though. I've got distinguished guests to start with the third of the series. So I hope that most of you are already kind of familiar with what we're doing here. But essentially, what we do is we look at one of the motions that have been set at Australs, and we do a practice prep, and we consider the types of things that we need to be thinking about from a like technical view of prep and how to make that best function. And then you get to see it play out in the real world. So I'm joined by Ollie and Seamus. Tell me, what do you two prioritize when you think of prepping?
Well, Seamus and I have actually prepped a lot together because we've been in a lot of teams. So I think we have pretty similar thoughts on the matter. I think the most important thing to do first off is to get the most ideas out possible in the most succinct way possible, which means that a really important part of it for us is once we've got an idea or once an idea has been expressed, to the extent that it needs to be, moving on very quickly and letting the actual mechs and the smaller details come out when you're actually writing the case. Then following that, once we've got everything together, we typically have one person in prep, normally the first speaker, just walk everyone through everything they've heard in a more coherent structure. So trying to organize it into arguments. And then from there comes a discussion about how to best, I guess, turn that into a proper case.
Nice. Similar, Seamus?
Yeah, I think that captures my thoughts. I think one thing I'd add is when I'm brainstorming and we're going through ideas, I try to go top down. So I'll start with sort of definitional, characterization, contextual questions. Then I'll always check to see if there's some sort of principal claim. I'll think about a model. And if you're struggling with like this part of prep, I think a really easy, good thing you can do is honestly just write yourself a checklist and just write, have I thought about any tricky models? Have I thought about whether or not they'll do a tricky counter model? What keyword is in this motion? What verb? And just so on and so forth. And just that's really what good debaters are doing. They've just gotten very practiced at it. Tick, 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 tick.
Yeah, and if I can add one thing, I think one thing Seamus and I got in the habit of doing is in positions where we were stuck, just thinking from the perspective of what would be useful to prove, and then deciding if that thing is possible to prove. So if there's an outcome that we know would be debate winning, is that something we can prove? And then trying to work at it backwards from that perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the fun things about doing this exercise is hearing very good debaters touch on essentially the same concepts, like figuring out the characterization questions, figuring out tricky models, thinking about what is important within the debate, and just framing it through slightly different lenses that give each debater like a slight probably different set of prioritization when they're thinking through things. So out of the two of you, was it normally you, Ollie, who was that in that first speaker role of taking in things and reflecting it back?
I don't speak first.
Yeah, he can't speak first. Yeah,
that's why he's my partner.
So I have kind of done that in the last two practice preps. So I'm going to throw it over to you to do what you did in your normal Australs prep. So we'll let you guide prep from here. And the motion we're going to be doing is from round 3 of Australs. And that motion is that Latin American countries should form an economic and political bloc. So normally, do you start with the silent prep?
Yeah, we normally start with just a few minutes just to get our thoughts down and
cool.
have a think. I'm assuming you'll cut that from the recording.
Nah. People.
Oh, they're going to see us silently think. I love it.
Okay, so my little timer is about to go to 4 minutes now. So shall we reconvene at 6 minutes?
We're affirmative, yeah?
Yeah, affirming.
We should have clarified, yeah. All right.
Okay, that's gone 2 minutes.
Awesome. Let's start and have a bit of a share. Shane, do you want to get us cracking? What are you thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to consider is, what does an economic and political bloc look like? You referred earlier to the European Union, and I think that's obviously the most popular version of an economic and political bloc. But it's easier to imagine an economic and political bloc which doesn't have the same extremely high degree of buy-in that the Schengen Agreement requires. So, for instance, ASEAN or the Arab League, I wouldn't necessarily call them political and economic blocs, but they make sense as sort of IGOs and groupings of countries, definitely politically, which don't require you to, for instance, have full immigration between them and stuff like that. So as a point of context, I think that's fairly useful to just establish we don't want this debate to be EU in Latin America, and we can feel free to pick and choose which parts of that model we actually think are good, which we might do in a second. The other thing I think to look at in framing is that there is already somewhat of an economic and political bloc in Latin America, called the Organization of American States. There's a series of reasons why that's historically not been a particularly good organization in that region. For one, it is dominated by America. For another, a lot of Latin American countries haven't bought in. It's had a series of disputes with countries like Brazil and Honduras. So I think we can have some sort of argument, maybe it's second speaker that we'll see, about why this would sort of lead to a healthier balance of power and a healthier dialogue in that respect. I then, for the rest of my prep, because it was quite quick, really just looked at two basic things. The first was, I think, the key benefits of these sorts of blocks, and the second are the challenges that these blocks are likely to overcome and preempting some of those challenges. So in terms of benefits, I think there's a lot of interesting material economically, which I think the three of us as people who've done a lot of debating would probably immediately sort of rush to, but the idea of lowering trade barriers, the idea that you could sort of more easily economically cooperate with other states, the idea that you could sort of synchronize and create economies of scale by more consciously using your economies together. And I think a really intuitive way to think about this is by breaking down the barriers between a lot of these small countries. In a way, you're sort of making a bigger country, which is a multiplier of their economic power. It means that they'll be able to make smarter and larger decisions in that area. I won't take up too much more time, but I think the other big one is that this is a power multiplier in terms of international and diplomatic efforts. So to the extent that there are problems in Latin America, I think when you are formally tied to those other countries, it makes it a lot more likely that you're going to come to the negotiating table. We've seen, I think Latin America is a bit underanalyzed in debating. There are plenty of issues in Latin America, obviously immigration, issues with respect to transnational crime between those borders. There's also a series of issues with respect to trade disputes. For instance, like Guatemala has a bunch of trade disputes with a series of other states. So being able to negotiate those more helpfully and having an argument about why this leads to more accord there, I think is useful. Finally, in terms of benefits, the third one I could think of is just a power multiplier in international fora, and being able to have a much louder voice on an international stage, being able to collectivize your votes at the UN General Assembly in the way that we see, for instance, Arab states do, but we don't see Latin American states do. And I think you could particularly tie this to negotiating power with the hegemon of their region, which is the United States. So the United States at the moment can sort of pick off, and they do pick off, individual Latin American countries and make individual deals with them. And now, if you're a unified bloc, you can get conditions that affect all of you together and much more favorable conditions, because a lot of their inputs rely upon exports from your countries. I feel like I've talked for a fair amount, so I might pass it on to you, Ollie.
No, Dan.
Oh, Dan?
Yeah, so I had similar thoughts about how this needs to be a EU with Latin American characteristics, and I tried to think about some of the basic things that did need to be within our model. So rather than like a subtracting, rather than trying to find that basic, and I think at its core, it needs to be probably much more free flow of goods. I think you're right to say that it doesn't necessarily need to be free flow of people, but the economic degree of connection is probably necessary there. And then obviously this is also a political union, and that word political union is so vague, right? Because the United States model is a political union where certain powers are delegated to states, certain power delegated to federal government. You have instances like Quebec in Canada that basically govern self-autonomously. You have UK. So like, what will this political union look like? How much power and which spheres are delegated to individual countries and which spheres are now delegated to that federal system? I think we've got a lot of room to kind of like play with that there. And we have to kind of think through from the perspective of those like framework issues, like what do we care about as to how we draw those lines. The other thing I think was important, and that's like the other end of the comparative, is really figuring out what they're going to say about the status quo, or like how they're going to push this. And I think they're obviously going to come out with a much stronger defense of sovereignty, pushing that political union to the end of the dividing line, and talking about why it's important to control goods and people, and laws to develop solid identities, and to have international independence. And so I think two things are probably important then for the framework. I won't go over like those basics again, though I would say that one of the big reasons we had the EU is peace, and I wanted to maybe throw out there what degree does conflict between these nations get dampened in this political union. But I think it's obviously much less important than in Europe post World War II. And so the first is to say I think there's a trade-off that exists within this debate when we're looking at interests, because you give up some places where you might disagree with the overall body. So when would you might get overruled, and why does the multiplier effect mean that it's worth sacrificing some of these smaller differences in order to push your common interests more effectively? So we have to characterize really strongly what are the common interests of Latin American states, how do they multiply them, and then I think importantly, why can this not be done organically? Why does the structure important here that gets built up? And I think that's actually largely about not just reflecting like preferences that nations currently already have, but basically standardizing and building those political bonds that actually bring their preferences into alignment. And rather than treat them as having fixed preferences, look at how that gets shaped.
Cool. All right, a lot of good stuff there. My contributions are mainly just structural stuff and recommendations for how we build this out. So my first thought is that I think we should probably push a lot of the more defensive or preemptive material down to second, and either have it as direct responsible preemptive to later down the case. Just because I think for us to do this case credit, we're gonna have to spend a lot of time in setup, and that's effectively gonna function as our preemptive anyway. And I think in the absence of that, what we're trading off at first is the ability to come out really strongly pushing an issue and saying, if this issue is not solved, Latin America is in a really bad position, really hamming on the emphasis and the impetus rather. Second thing I have is that I think the thing that's missing the most from our case at the moment is tying a lot of the problems that we're describing, the benefits that we're describing, to really specific problems in the status quo, and explain why those are the problems that we need to solve. Because I think it's going to be pretty easy in this debate for either side to be able to suggest, here are generic benefits of a union, here are generic harms of a union, and explaining, and at that point, it's essentially just which team sounds the best is the risk that we run with a lot of judges. So I think what we want to instead do is find the best grounding possible to explain why the status quo specifically requires the benefits, and why it can specifically weather the harms that opposition is likely to bring out. So my broad suggestion is pretty simple in terms of case stuff. First thing, I think we should just do a longer than normal introduction, just to really trade off the fact that we're going to have to spend like a minute plus on setup probably. Then secondly, following that, I think we should just break it down into economic politics, and then based on how we prep, just decide which one of those two should go first based on how important it is. Does that sound good?
Do you think that there are because economics and politics are kind of like, they're both aspects of this union and also benefits we get out of this union. Do you think that's the cleanest way to split it up, or is there anything more fundamental? Because I think one thing we do need to consider is like, what we're actually changing here is nations being able to pursue individual interests versus collectivizing and giving up some individual interests. And it may be the case that the best way to approach that idea is by just like explaining how it plays out in the economic sphere, explaining how it plays out in the political sphere. And now that I think about it, I think that probably is the neatest way to do it. Obviously, politics needs to be split into like within Latin America and outside of Latin America. Yeah. I know that might get a little bit more complex.
My worry about that, about the question of, how do you trade it off, is that it's so different for both politics and economics that you can't sort of split it up.
And also might be also too big. Like, you know what I mean? Like you could spend 6 minutes trying to come up with this unified theory of political engagement, and there might actually just be something that evolves. So we need to like situate it quite strongly in tangible outcomes. Shall we just quickly then walk through what those 2 points would look like? The economic stuff, making sure we're getting everything we talked about.
Sure. I'll just very quickly note, I think as well, we're going to retread ground if we do micro-macro, so individual state benefit to the collective, because a lot of our mechanisms benefit both at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So our argument, I think we would weave in the impacting to separate them into those two things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's start with politics. The first thing I want to establish, as you suggested, DMG, just break it up into talking about LATAM and then international. And then if we see some natural synergies, we can maybe restructure it. But I think first and biggest thing, I'm not the most knowledgeable in Latin America. So what are the specific problems with respect to cooperation politically in Latin America that would require a union to solve those issues?
Yeah. Sorry, before we dive into that, I think there's one slightly, I think there's a third actual sphere in this operates. And I don't know if we want to go there, so I just want to head it off. Obviously, one of the things that the EU does is protect citizens of EU states from the state. So for instance, the EU.
Oh, I was thinking about that within Latin America.
Yeah. I think it splits out because there's also like interstate disputes and then there's like intrastate engagement. Do we want to talk about like making it more difficult for Bolsonaro to undermine elections? Is that like something we're like interested in?
Yeah, so I think the difficulty with jumping straight into the arguments in a debate that's so setup heavy is I feel like that's something that the three of us would probably in a real, actually have a proper conversation about before going into those things. I think probably the end point of that discussion would likely be we can run some material on that, but it is very unlikely that an economic and political bloc would survive very long or realistically be structured like that, i.e. having a European Court of Human Rights and stuff, like organs like that. I just don't think that's super plausible. So again, I think that's something we could stick at second or try and weave in somewhere or run a more watered down version of it. For instance, a more watered down mechanism might simply be you have an increased degree of standing in domestic courts of other states, or there's an international forum you can access. Which I think gets those benefits but slightly less more.
Yeah, actually, the other contribution that I have really briefly to that is my concern is that we're going to spend more time explaining why this wouldn't lead to more strife and conflict than we would actually be getting out of bolstering our other material.
I agree. So then it leaves those other two slightly like larger spheres that we concentrate our time. So first, I think one of the big issues that exists in Latin America is essentially kind of like low-level disputes between members. And I think those intensify, particularly in the context of climate change. So stuff like water conflict is becoming much more common in Latin America. There's some ongoing territorial disputes that are happening. And I think what we can effectively establish here is that the structure of an international body is that it dampens the kind of short-term interests of member states to intensify conflict and helps de-escalate those types of conflicts. So literally just saying one of the worst outcomes that can happen is Ecuador and Colombia go to war over changing river deltas. We need to have a very clear, thought-out framework for how we deal with the effects of climate change so that it doesn't lead to those individual states coming to blows over that.
The other thing I'll say just on that is that I think it also provides a better forum for mediation where those disputes aren't naturally resolved through this mechanism anyway. DMG, can you pause the recording for just like 1 sec? Okay, what other issues are we going to solve?
In terms of politics for Latin America?
Yeah, specifically within Latin America.
In terms of other issues, I think the real big one is actually immigration. Like historically, there are so many disputes with respect to, because their borders are generally very porous and because there is, generally speaking, quite a lot of immigration from places like Venezuela and Honduras, and because those represent, drains on social security, it can also mean that the United States gets very angry. I think historically, my understanding is that's been the biggest sort of instigator of strikers.
How do we fix that? What does fixing that look like?
Just my initial contribution is when you're more economically aligned as a bloc, it means that immigration is less harmful to any one state. But I think also on top of that, it means that there's less incentive to immigrate when countries have more of a chance at the same economic outcomes, no matter what actual state they're in.
Yeah, it's essentially like close to a sort of revenue sharing system.
Yeah.
Like the reality is that a lot of these Latin American states have fairly similar sized economies. Obviously, there are some exceptions to that. But because of that, you have equal opportunities or much better opportunities in the places that are not so good at the moment. And also probably a lot more ability to freely transit between those places as sort of is sort of the model.
So I get from that, there's one issue about like standardization and basically decreasing the really strong pull effect. But I also think there's a good argument to be made about basically collectivizing the benefits that come from immigration. So if people move from one nation to the other, if you've got a bonded political identity and bonded economic outcomes with that nation, you see it as less of a brain drain harm. You see it as less of people coming in and stealing your jobs. You're more likely to just consider that from the perspective of like the economic reasons why immigration is good rather than the competitive and political reasons why people oppose immigration.
Yeah, the last thing I'll just add around immigration is that I think it's much more likely now that pathways to more legitimized or recognized forms of immigration are going to be a lot more common in contexts where the governments are more likely to comply and open up pathways for that to occur. So rather than getting the kinds of, I guess, less formalized immigration that might lead to more conflict, you get this kind of formalized immigration.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other big ones to go to us?
I thought of another argument that doesn't really fit here, but I think it's quite good. No.
Yeah, okay, cool. All right.
More political one then, and that's that. How do we respond to threats to Latin America as a whole? And so I think that brings on what Seamus was speaking about, like the US or China picking off individual nations, so having that much stronger collective bargaining rights. And I think that's a really intuitive argument to make. So I don't think we need to spend a huge amount of time on it. It's like you get bullied less.
Yeah, I thought this was going down here, but yeah, I agree. I think that's important. I think it should be fairly intuitive.
I think a couple other things. Firstly, I think there's less need to welcome in foreign aggressors as any individual nation when you're stronger because you can rely on the bloc, which is to say that you don't need America or China to come in if you are able to rely on, for example, a collective of other Latin American nations to fulfill the same requirements. And then the other thing that I had just around that was that in the instances in which one state is clearly threatening the interests of other states by allowing foreign interests in, and not allowing foreign interests in, it also then just allows the bloc to respond to that particular nation. That might run into the same tension we described earlier about states being too interventionists, but I think it's worth throwing in as a bone if it becomes a problem when you drop it.
Yep, I agree.
And sorry, just because we're coming to the end of the 30 minutes, do we want to discuss the economic stuff very briefly? Because I think it reflects what Seamus was saying about economies of scale. But I think the other like ordinary intuitive argument you'd run is about specialization. So basically just like allowing industry to, while of course it might hurt your car industry when it gets consolidated in a particular nation that specializes in producing cars, you equally benefit from things that you are good at becoming specialized and getting more market dominance in that, which improves the overall efficiency like of the bloc. And I think also Seamus's context about these economies not being that different is actually quite important here, because obviously one of the big problems with globalizations is when one nation is good at everything and one nation is good at none of the things. And that's much less likely to be the case in Latin America with like relatively similar economies than globalization on a much larger scale.
Yeah, so I think I'll say a few things. The first is there are assets which sharing them are net positive, because usually you give steel to someone else. Cool, they have the steel, you don't have the steel anymore. And I think that's where the specialization and economies of scale material comes in. But the other like crucial one is stuff like IP and proficiencies. Like there are all sorts of soft assets that sharing them with other states doesn't really disadvantage you almost at all, but does boost them up. And if them making more money and being more stable is good for you, then that's obviously great. The other argument that we haven't discussed thus far I wanted to touch on are the economic benefits of stability. So having an economic union obviously means that each individual economy is more economically stable. I think that analysis is pretty straightforward, but for instance, the fact that you're insured, like look at Greece getting bailed out by the EU, 10 years ago, it's better for FDI.
Yeah, that material, specifically the FDI stuff, I think should go at the head of this argument as a piece of framing. For the reason that I think it's much more likely that the political stuff, given that we're going for a softer touch on the political stuff, will be a clearer win for us. So being able to frame the political stuff as an immediate win over the status quo for the economic stuff, I think does us a substantial good and means that we can fall back on the economic stuff.
As a last addendum to stability, it's not just that these nations will help you when you get bailed out, they also prevent you from making bad decisions. So we should actually be quite defensive here about why the type of expertise sharing between central banks, overall coordination, like especially if two nations have like are really dependent on each other for trade, currency fluctuations because of central bank decisions in one state can have quite a big effect on another state. So having a really open, clear line of communication, thinking about, well, how do we do best for our overall political union rather than necessarily only doing uncoordinated self-interest, can do a lot of good there. Have there been any, maybe Argentina is a great example of a nation that has made quite a few poor monetary policy decisions.
Quite a few.
Why we think that would be less likely in a world where they're heavily bonded to other Latin American states.
Do you reckon we give them a currency? We haven't discussed that. Do they get the Lado?
The Lado?
Amerigo?
Yeah. Nah. Okay, neat. I think that brings us to the end of our prep. We've got to go, obviously, judge some debates. But this was a lot of fun. Thanks very much. I hope everyone enjoys watching this. Seeing once again the beautiful diversity that exists among good debaters. Excellent. Thank you, guys.
Great.
See ya.
Yeah.